The young nurse leaned in close, her voice barely a breath. "I know how to wake him," she said to the exhausted man in wrinkled scrubs who just happened to be a millionaire CEO and a heartbroken father. He hadn't heard hope in months. But tonight, something in her eyes made him stop breathing. What did she mean? And could it really be true? What happened next was truly miraculous. I said I didn't want any more updates unless something really changed. Matthew Carter's voice was hoarse like dry wood as it echoed down the empty hospital corridor. His dark blue scrubs, now wrinkled and yellowed from many sleepless nights, clung to him as if bearing his sorrow. The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows on the sterile white walls of the pediatric ICU. It was nearly midnight, but time had lost all meaning for him. His 4-year-old son, Paul, lay motionless in the hospital bed, his small chest rising and falling with the help of machines. 3 months earlier, a drunk driver had taken Matthew's wife's life and left Paul in a coma. Since then, Matthew, once a skilled and respected CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company, had become a fixture in room 214, silent, vacant-eyed, and slowly breaking down. Tonight, like every night, he sat beside Paul's bed, head bowed, clutching the little stuffed dinosaur his son loved. His eyes were red, not from crying, he had passed that stage long ago, but from exhaustion and the quiet pain of helplessness. Soft footsteps echoed behind him. "Mr. Carter." A gentle voice broke the silence. He didn't turn around. "I told you no more updates," he muttered hoarsely. "I'm not here to update you," the voice answered, now calmer. A warm, confident hand touched his shoulder. "I believe I can wake your son." Matthew suddenly looked up. He turned and saw a young woman standing beside him. Her hospital ID read, Sandra Miller, RN. Her golden hair was neatly tied back, though a few curls framed her face. She couldn't be older than 26. Her sea-blue eyes held no arrogance or pity, only certainty. "What did you say?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "I said, I believe I can wake your son," Sandra repeated, her voice calm and steady. Matthew blinked. "With all due respect, Nurse Miller, I've spoken to every neurologist in this building. They told me Paul's brain activity is minimal. They said to prepare for decisions. Exactly what do you think you can do that they can't?" Sandra lowered herself to his level, serious but gentle. "I know how that sounds. I'm not here to give you false hope. I'm researching a therapy, an emotional bonding protocol. It involves continuous emotional stimulation, guided memory cues, and sensory triggers, things beyond clinical measures, to reach something deeper." He stared at her quietly, teeth clenched. "You want to talk to my son, don't you?" "He hasn't moved a muscle in 3 months," Sandra said. "I'm not just talking. I will communicate. There's a difference." Matthew leaned back and shook his head. "I don't need another miracle theory. I need the truth. I helped a little girl named Ava. She was in a coma for 6 weeks after a seizure." Sandra continued. "Everyone gave up. I didn't. I tried this with her. She woke up. The doctors couldn't explain it, but her parents saw it. They knew what worked. She's still recovering. But she opened her eyes. She spoke her first word a week later." Matthew looked down at Paul. The boy's pale, peaceful face showed no sign of the chaos his small body endured. "That was 6 weeks. Paul has been like this for 12. I know that makes things harder, but not impossible." The boy sighed. "Did you get hospital approval? I'm allowed to perform non-invasive therapy. I'm not suggesting anything harmful. I will sit with the boy, talk to him, gently stimulate his senses, music, familiar feelings, even recorded voices. Your voice, if you allow me." Matthew hesitated. For a moment, the CEO in him rose up, demanding control, logic, reason. But then he looked at Paul, the boy who once mocked frogs in their backyard, called pancakes round clouds, and hadn't felt his father's embrace for months. What do you want from me?" Matthew quietly asked. "Just your permission. 1 week. Let me try for 1 week." He studied her, the way she stood firm, calm voice, the quiet fire behind her eyes. She didn't sell him hope. She believed in it. She believed in his son. Against all reason, something stirred inside him. A faint spark, but real. Finally, he said she only had 1 week, And if he saw even the smallest sign that she made things worse, it would end. Sandra nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I won't disappoint you." He watched as she turned to Paul, gently brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. She leaned closer and whispered something only Paul could hear. And for the first time in weeks, Matthew stayed to listen. Sandra began treating Paul with a method she developed herself, called emotional memory immersion, or EMI for short. This method was born from her own experience caring for her mother during a coma and her deep research into how emotional memories can stimulate brain recovery. Every day, she spent 6 uninterrupted hours with Paul, not just being present, but actively awakening the sleeping memories hidden deep in his subconscious using a multisensory system that activates every gateway to memory. Sandra didn't just sit by Paul's bedside. She built a world for him. Every day, she played carefully selected sounds from his past, his father's voice reading bedtime stories, the sizzling sound of pancakes on Sunday mornings, and the gentle lullabies his mother used to sing. These were not random recordings. They were fragments of the life Paul once knew, arranged to the rhythm of the days he used to live. She also filled the room with familiar scents, the warm, sweet smell of children's orange vanilla shampoo, the comforting butter scent of pancakes, even the smell of wet earth after rain. She recreated them using oils and diffusers, layering memories into the air. From old family videos, Sandra learned how Paul's mother used to stroke his hair, gently pat his back in slow rhythms, hold him just right when he was tired. Sandra repeated those exact gestures, gently, carefully, as if her hands could whisper to his skin what words could not. Even the lighting was part of the therapy. She used a color system matching each moment of the day. Amber for stories about maternal love, pale blue for outdoor playtime stories, lavender when it was bedtime. The room moved with emotion, like a story Paul could feel all around him. And every day followed a script, a routine created to reflect the life Paul once had. Sandra would greet him like his mother used to, tell him it was time for lunch with his dad on the balcony, take him on an imaginary park tour, hold an imaginary leash for his toy dinosaur. At night, she would bathe him with words, dress him with memories, and lay him down with the same old dinosaur book, ending with a song she barely remembered learning. At the end of each session, she would place one hand on Paul's heart, the other on hers, and breathe slowly together. She called it heart synchronization. No machines, no screens, just human rhythms shared. A quiet conversation between souls. She wasn't just reminding Paul of life, she was inviting him back to it. Every day, Matthew stood behind the glass, watching. He was a man who once bent industries with a single decision. Now he is powerless. No amount of money can buy his son's voice. But here, this young nurse, this gentle blonde girl, is doing something no doctor dares to promise. His skepticism turns into silent admiration. He started bringing her coffee in the morning, then sandwiches, then a soft blanket when he realized she stayed all night. He never spoke those words, but his gestures said much more. "I understand you. I believe in you." One night, when Sandra was singing to Paul under the soft orange glow of the memorial lamp, Matthew watched with clenched jaws and a heavy chest. That light reminded him of the hospital room the night his wife died, her half-open eyes, the last look towards their son. He took her hand and whispered, "You don't have to worry about him. I will take care of our son." That promise became both his anchor and his burden. Then, on the 12th night of treatment, it happened. Sandra had just finished telling Paul a bedtime story about a spaceship flying to the moon. She bent down to brush his hair and noticed something unusual. A tear silently slid from the corner of Paul's left eye, leaving a sparkling trail on his cheek. She froze. "Paul," she whispered, her hand gently holding his face. No change, no startle, but the tear was real, warm, and human. She hurried out of the room, her voice trembling. "Matthew, come here." "Paul." Matthew ran in, holding his breath. He followed her gaze and saw the unmistakable wet streak on his son's cheek. "Oh God," he whispered, collapsing beside the bed. "What do you think he sensed the story?" Sandra asked, voice choked. "I don't know," Matthew replied softly. He held Paul's hand tightly. but I think he's trying to come back to us." From that night on, Matthew never left the room. The following days were not easy. News of the ragged incident spread quickly throughout the ward. Some staff found it very touching. However, others were not so kind. Sandra began to feel a subtle shift in the energy, conversation stopping when she entered the room, sideways glances, whispered disdain hidden behind coffee cups. She thinks she can wake him up with fairy tales. A nurse muttered in the break room, "She's sweet, but it's all just in her head. It's dangerous." Another added, "A desperate father. She's giving him false hope." Sandra heard every word, even though no one said it directly to her. Yet she kept to her routine with Paul, unwavering. But the burden of isolation weighed heavier on her shoulders every day. Matthew noticed. He overheard such a conversation by chance while passing the nurse's station. When the two nurses turned to see him standing silently, their faces went pale. "Is there a problem?" he asked, cold and calm. "No, Mr. Carter," one of them stammered. "Then maybe you can put your energy to better use than mocking someone who has done more for my son than any of you in 3 months." The silence that followed was absolute. That same day, Sandra found a single white rose on her desk. A note was clipped beneath it, written in neat, careful handwriting. "Don't let the noise drown out what only your heart can hear. M." From then on, a silent understanding formed between them. They began talking outside Paul's room, sometimes just passing comments about the weather or the hospital coffee. Other times, deeper. One evening, as they sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, Sandra shared a part of her past. "My mother had a stroke when I was 20, she said softly. "The doctors told me she would never wake up, but I didn't believe it. I moved back home, cared for her every day, read to her, sang to her, even when it felt like I was talking to the wind." Matthew studied her face closely, seeing both pain and pride there, and he asked. 2 years later, she recounted. Her eyes gently brightened. She opened her eyes. She remembered my name. He was silent for a long moment, then almost whispered, "That's why you believe in Paul." Sandra nodded. It wasn't blind hope. It was memory and love. The next night, Matthew went to find Sandra after her shift. He brought a book Paul once loved, one about trains, and wanted to see if she would read it to him. But she wasn't at her desk or in the break room. Something urged him on, a quiet concern. Then he remembered the chapel. The hospital chapel was always dark and quiet, the stained glass windows glowing softly in the moonlight. He stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. At the last pew, Sandra sat, head bowed, hands clenched tight. Quiet tears ran down her cheeks. She was completely alone. Matthew stood there for a moment, heartbroken. Then he gently took off his coat and walked to the pew behind her. Without a word, he placed the coat on her shoulders. He slipped a small folded note into her hand and quietly left. When Sandra unfolded the note minutes later, she held her breath. "You're not alone in this, Matthew." She hugged it to her chest and cried, this time not out of loneliness, but something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Belonging. The first time it happened, it was so subtle Sandra almost missed it. She was adjusting Paul's blanket, humming the lullaby tune she always ended the song with as she moved, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," when she noticed his left hand twitching not a spasm, but a small, intentional bend of his fingers. She froze, her heart pounding. "Paul," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, just like the soft wings of a bird. Sandra ran to call Matthew when he rushed in, gasping and wide-eyed. She pointed at Paul's hand. "Look." His fingers moved. "I saw it." Matthew bent down, his eyes scanning every inch of his son's face. And then he saw it too. A faint spark flickered under the eyelid. Paul's eyes didn't open, but there was movement, reaction, presence. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Matthew exhaled, a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "He's in there," he said, barely believing it. "He's really in there." They called the medical team in. The doctors ran tests, checked vital signs, and examined brain responses. The results were inconclusive, but for Sandra and Matthew, it was a miracle. They didn't celebrate. Not yet, but their eyes began to hold something both were too scared to carry: cautious hope. 2 days later, Matthew came to see Sandra after her shift. "I was thinking," he began, rubbing the back of his neck like a teenager unsure of his words. "Maybe you and I could have dinner somewhere outside this building, just to get some fresh air." Sandra hesitated. Then she smiled, her eyes softening. "As friends, as two people sharing something important," he said, "and maybe those who needed to remember what normal felt like, even if just for one night." That Friday night, Sandra appeared outside the hospital entrance, her blonde hair softly curled, wearing a simple navy blue dress that fell just above her knees. She looked elegant and effortless, but to Matthew, she looked radiant. He stood silently for a long moment. "You're staring," she said with an embarrassed laugh. "I know," he answered honestly. "I wasn't prepared." They dined at a quiet Italian restaurant nestled between two brownstone houses downtown. It was the kind of place where candles flicker and time seems to slow down. Their conversation started easy, light, even cheerful, but it didn't take long to deepen. "He used to think family was something you built after you made it," Matthew said, swirling his wine glass unconsciously, like a prize at the end of a marathon. "Then it all happened, and I realized I had misunderstood." Sandra nodded. "Family is not a reward. That's why." He looked at her, his eyes gentle. "Do you think you'll have a family of your own someday?" "He used to think maybe not," she said, a brief sadness flickering across her face. "After everything with my mother, wanting more feels selfish. But now, I think maybe love is meant to be shared, not kept." Their eyes met across the table, and in that brief moment, the chaos of the hospital, the pain, the waiting, all faded away. Only they remained, two souls finding light in the darkness. Then Sandra's phone rang. She frowned. It was the nurse's station. "They knew I'd turned it off," she answered, curiosity on her face quickly turning to shock. "Wait, can you say that again?" Matthew leaned forward. "What is it?" She put it on speaker. The voice of a nurse came through, breathless with excitement. "Sandra." Paul just spoke. One word, small but clear. "What did he say?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling. "Dad," he said. "Dad." Matthew's fork clinked against his plate. He stood frozen. "He called my name. He whispered." Sandra nodded, eyes wide and sparkling, "and said, 'Your name.'" They stood silent, hearts pounding with a joy no one dared to imagine. In that candlelit restaurant, among glasses of wine and heartfelt confessions, the impossible began to unfold. Paul spoke, and for the first time in months, Matthew Carter smiled. Not the smile of an executive, but of a father whose world was slowly coming back to life. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hum of the oxygen machine. Matthew sat by Paul's bedside, one arm holding his son's, the other clutching a small toy train Paul always carried around. Across the room, Sandra stood quietly, her heart pounding in silent anticipation. 2 days had passed since Paul spoke his first word, "Dad." Since then, he'd been quieter, eyes still closed, body motionless. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. They said the words might be unconscious, reflexive, not necessarily intentional. But Sandra believed otherwise. So did Matthew. That morning, the atmosphere in the room felt different, lighter, brighter. Sandra leaned in, stroking a curl on Paul's forehead. "Paul, sweetheart," she whispered gently, "if you can hear me, just open your eyes. We're here. Your dad is here. I'm here." And then it happened, slowly, with a gentle flutter like leaves in the wind. Paul's eyelids opened. At first, just a fragile sliver of light peeking through, then wider, his eyes fully open, blinking in the soft light of the room. Matthew froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Paul," he whispered, unable to believe his voice. Paul turned his head slightly toward the sound. "Dad," he said, hoarse but clear. Matthew knelt by the bed, sobbing as he clasped Paul's hand with both of his. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here. You've got me." Paul's gaze slowly swept over his father and settled on Sandra, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Angel," he whispered. Sandra gasped, her hands covering her mouth. She could barely speak. "He did it. He just did. Matthew turned to her, tears welling in his eyes. Lou, my angel. Tears streamed down Sandra's face. She knelt beside Matthew, her hand touching Paul's. Hello, sweetheart, she said softly, her voice trembling. I missed you. Paul reached toward her, his small arm trembling as he wrapped it gently around her neck. And that's when the room changed. The door opened, and 2 nurses stepped in, their usual composure disappearing the moment they saw what was happening. One of them called the doctor, who rushed in a few minutes later, followed by several other staff members. The monitors were checked, pupils examined, vital signs recorded, but none of them could explain what they were witnessing. He shouldn't be reacting this fast, one doctor whispered to another. Last week, his brain scan barely showed any high perpendicular patterns. Spontaneous neurological recovery, another guest said, but Matthew knew better. So did Sandra. This was not random. This was not science. This was love. This was patience. Storybooks and lullabies sung in the dark. This was months of unwavering faith. This was a miracle born not just from medicine, but from something far more powerful. Sandra remained kneeling by the bed, one hand gently resting on Paul's shoulder. He didn't let go of her. His small body leaned toward her with the silent trust of a child who has known her in the deepest part of unconsciousness. Matthew, still by their side, kissed his son's forehead. He looked up at Sandra, his voice rough with emotion. You did this, he said. You brought him back. No, she whispered. He came back because you never gave up. But Matthew shook his head. No, he would never have come this far without you. Paul sighed sleepily, closed his eyes again, but this time not in a coma, but in rest, in safety, the kind of rest that only a child can have when they truly know they are surrounded by love, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by doctors, nurses, and machines that no longer mattered. A boy, a father, and a young nurse had become something more than survivors. They had become a family. Matthew's backyard was simple yet beautiful, decorated with soft string lights and surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and gentle lavender. The evening air carried a hint of spring warmth, and everything in the scene felt like a quiet celebration of life. Sandra stepped through the back gate, wearing a soft cream dress and holding a small gift wrapped in one hand. She wasn't expecting anything extravagant, just a thank you dinner. But the moment she saw the table set under the warm yellow lights, and Paul sitting happily with a paper crown on his head, her heart tightened. Matthew smiled as he walked toward her. You did it. I said it would just be a simple dinner, she replied with a teasing look. Her voice barely changed. Looks like a movie set. He chuckled. Let's just say I got a little help from a 4-year-old with very strong opinions about balloons and cupcakes. They ate on the porch, quietly laughing as Paul devoured his ice cream topping without shame. Soft music drifted in the background. Frank Sinatra, Billie Holiday, old songs wrapped around you like a memory. After dessert, Matthew disappeared into the house for a moment. When he returned, he held a square box wrapped in dark green paper. This is for you, he said, handing it to Sandra. She looked up at him, surprised. I didn't expect you to open it. Inside was a leather-bound photo album. On the front, embossed in gold, was written, For the Angel Who Stayed. Sandra opened the cover and held her breath. Each page was filled with photos, small, genuine moments from the past 3 months. There she was, holding Paul's hand during a lullaby, reading aloud a story, bright eyes, tucking a blanket under his chin with tenderness that almost leapt off the page. Every picture captured a moment when she thought no one was watching, but someone was watching. You were watching, she whispered, her voice trembling. Not in a weird way, Matthew said quickly. He just didn't want to forget what hope looked like, and he had seen it in her every day. Sandra slowly flipped through each page, speechless. Each photo was a reminder of the hardest chapter in her life, and somehow also the most beautiful. On the last page, a handwritten note. You didn't just wake my son. You woke something in me I thought was lost. She looked up, tears welling in her eyes. Matthew stepped closer, gently taking her hand. I'm angry at the world, he said softly. angry at God, angry at himself. He thought love had died with his wife. He thought all he had left was work and silence, along with a son he might never hold again. Sandra shook her head, her lips trembling. "I will never give up. I've given up on you," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "But you haven't. You came and changed everything with your stubborn hope, with your voice, with your heart." The lights around them flickered softly in the warm night breeze. Paul had fallen asleep in the nearby hammock, his toy dinosaur lying beside him like an old friend. Matthew tucked a strand of Sandra's hair behind her ear, his hand lingering on her cheek. "May I?" he whispered. She nodded. He leaned down, and under the gentle glow of the golden lights, he kissed her. Not rushed, not dramatic, slow, steady, and filled with all the words they'd never said. When they pulled apart, she smiled through her tears. "Has it taken long enough?" Matthew laughed, pulling her into his arms. "You're not going anywhere." "Right, no," she whispered, resting her head against his chest. "I am exactly where I'm meant to be." The garden looked different now, more alive, more vibrant than ever. Once a quiet private corner behind Matthew's house, it had been lovingly transformed over the past months. New flowers bloomed in the beds, delicate string lights hung between the trees, and soft music floated through the late afternoon air. A year had passed, but the memory of that long, painful winter remained, of hospital walls, sleepless nights, and the cold ache of uncertainty. Now just a faint shadow against the joy blossoming around them today. White chairs lined the lush green lawn, facing a small wooden arch covered in ivy and pale yellow roses, the same color as Sandra's hair on the day Paul first spoke again. Beneath that arch stood Sandra, radiant in a flowing ivory dress fluttering in the breeze. Her golden hair shimmered in the golden hour light, and in her eyes danced a pure joy that softened the hearts of every guest present. Beside her, Matthew stood tall, in a soft gray suit, one hand gently holding hers, the other resting lightly on their son's shoulder. His gaze never left Sandra, not for a single second. It was the look of a man who had witnessed the world stripped down to its rawest truth and found something incredibly precious within it. Between them was Paul, now 5 years old, full of life and grinning ear to ear. He clutched a small satin pillow, with 2 wedding rings tied together by a golden ribbon. Every step he took that day, every word he spoke, was a testament to all they had overcome together. The ceremony was intimate and heartfelt. Their vows weren't romantic performances, but quiet promises spoken through tears and smiles, witnessed by friends, family, and those who had walked through fire with them. And when that moment came, when the final "I do" was said, gentle cheers and warm applause filled the garden like sunlight breaking through clouds. But what happened next truly stole everyone's hearts. Paul, his small chest puffed out with pride, turned to the crowd with all the seriousness a 5-year-old could muster, hugging a bouquet of yellow daisies nearly as big as his head. He spun around dramatically and tossed it over his shoulder. Laughter erupted as guests scrambled to catch it, some almost falling from their chairs. Matthew laughed, lifting their son into his arms, while Sandra watched them both with tear-filled eyes. In that moment, the 3 of them were more than just participants in a wedding. They were a living miracle. As the sun set and the guests mingled, the family stepped into a quieter spot in the yard, each holding a balloon, one red, one white, one sky blue. The strings tangled slightly as Paul fidgeted with his balloon. Sandra bent down, smoothing the boy's shirt, ready to send them. Paul nodded solemnly. "Tell me again what they said." Matthew knelt beside them, his voice warm. "Mine said hope, Mom said love, and I said miracle, because that's your mom." Paul's eyes lit up. "You are the miracle," he whispered, clutching the string tightly. "Yes, you are," Sandra whispered back, kissing the top of his head. "On 3, Matthew asked. Paul counted 1, 2, 3. Together, they released. The balloon slowly floated into the dark sky, rising higher and higher until they became tiny dots among the first stars. Silence fell, but it was the kind of silence filled with awe, peace, something sacred. That night, After the guests had left and the laughter had faded, Sandra walked into the kitchen and found a new drawing taped to the fridge. It was a family portrait. The pencil lines were uneven, the colors bold and cheerful. Matthew was drawn with outstretched arms and a bright smile. Sandra wore a sunny yellow dress, her long hair curling golden, and right in the middle was Paul, holding both their hands, his round face beaming. Above them, written in shaky but proud handwriting, was a single word, home. Sandra stared at it for a long time, her heart swelling with gratitude. They were not just survivors, they were a family. The narration, calm and profound, rose in Matthew's voice, weaving into the gentle images of the evening enveloping their home. "I think I have everything," he began, his voice low and steady. "I built an empire, controlled markets, closed million-dollar deals with a single phone call. But none of that mattered when I stood by my son's hospital bed, praying he would just squeeze my hand." The screen showed flickering memories. Matthew pacing the hospital hallway, Sandra softly reading to Paul, his eyes opening for the first time. "I thought strength was never falling, staying calm no matter what. But the truth is, real strength is having the courage to fall and still choose to love." He continued speaking. A long pause, then softer. "Sometimes it takes the kindness of a stranger to bring us back to life. Sometimes healing is wrapped in the voice of someone who won't give up, someone who sings to the silence, reads stories to the dark, and dares to believe in the impossible." The shot shifts to their living room, warm and gently lit. Sandra sits on the couch, arms gently cradling Paul, who has fallen asleep on her lap, a small hand clutching his favorite dinosaur. Her head tilts slightly as she drifts off, breathing slow and peaceful. Matthew quietly enters, wearing a t-shirt and fleece pajama pants. He pauses at the doorway, smiling at the two who reshaped his world. He slowly crosses the room, careful not to wake them, reaching for the knitted blanket draped over the armchair. He gently opens it and lays it over them. His hands linger a moment, fingers brushing Sandra's shoulder, then Paul's hair. He sits nearby, elbows on his knees, looking at them with quiet gratitude in his eyes. Life doesn't come with guarantees. His voice continues the story. There will always be losses that drain you, but sometimes, if you're lucky, you meet someone who reminds you how to breathe again. Through this powerful story, we're reminded that even in the darkest moments, hope can quietly take root through the smallest acts of compassion. Matthew's unwavering love for his son and the gentle courage of a young nurse show us that healing often begins not with grand gestures, but with the decision to stay, to care, and to believe when all seems lost. If you were moved by Matthew's quiet strength and the miracle that unfolded, consider sending him your love in the comments below. He's walked through unimaginable grief, and perhaps now is the time for him to let light back in. What would you say to someone who's given everything and is just beginning to breathe again? Let us know your thoughts and what you think Matthew's next chapter should look like. And if stories like this remind you of the resilience of the human spirit, we invite you to subscribe to Touching Tales Hub. Your support helps us keep sharing heartfelt journeys that touch souls, spark hope, and remind us that we are never truly alone.